Okay, I'm going to break this tutorial down into steps that are way easier to follow than you might imagine, so that you can have a go create this, including those really nice detailed footprints, and amaze yourself. Okay, so as explained in the intro, I'm going to break this down into steps so that you learn about the painting process and techniques, as well as about the app I'm using, Procreate. But that isn't to say you couldn't use a different app on a different tablet and still follow along. Having said that, within the app Procreate, I'm using the default A4 canvas, which might not apply to the US and some other places, but the dimensions are 297 by 210 millimeters at 300 dpi, or that is 3508 pixels by 2480 pixels. And also in terms of the color profile, I'm using the sRGB code, the one that ends in 2.1, here within Procreate. In terms of brushes, I'm going to be using airbrushing, soft, medium and medium hard brush. Within drawing, I'm going to be using the Evolve brush. Within artistic, the Leatherwood brush. And within organic, the Rainforest brush. And I've also pre-selected some colors in this section. Each of these colors, if we go to the value area, has what we call a hexadecimal code associated with it. Each of these codes is listed down in the video description, so you just need to copy and paste them one at a time into this box and press enter. The color will appear up here, and then you can tap it into the color palette for yourself, or alternatively next to the codes in the description is a link that takes you to my Patreon page, where you can download the color file for free to save you some time. And Patreon is also the place that you can support this channel and gain access to exclusive content such as extended versions of most of these tutorials. I'd like to say a massive thank you to those people who do support me over at Patreon. It really does make a huge difference, so thank you so much. And with all of that said and done, we're going to get started. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to rotate our canvas to the portrait orientation, and it will save it like that. When we go back into the gallery and return to the canvas, it will have saved it in the portrait orientation. Next, we're going to go to the first color on the top row of our color palette. It appears in the top right circle, and we're going to drag from that circle into the center of the canvas and release, and it flood fills the whole canvas. Okay, we're going to go to our layers, go to the plus symbol, click on that, and we'll get a new layer, layer 2. We're going to go to our colors, use the second color on the top row. We're going to go to our brushes, and we're going to use the airbrushing soft brush. We're going to put the brush size 20% and 100% opacity. And then in the top area, maybe about 2/3 of the way up, we're going to do a band of this. Then we're going to go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and we're going to blur that in pretty significantly. So maybe about 70% and deselect. Just to strengthen it up, I'll go to that layer, slide and duplicate it, and it doubles that strength. Tap on the top version, merge down, put it back to one layer again, create a new layer, layer 3. And we're going to go to the third color as well on the top row. We're going to stay with the soft brush within airbrushing, but we're going to change the brush size to maybe 10%, stay at the 100% opacity, and then just kind of in the center of what we've just created. Do a band of that, it doesn't need to be a particularly straight line. Adjustments, Gaussian blur, and then we're going to slide it across on the screen, not quite as far, maybe about 40%, and deselect. We've got a nice sort of color transition, nice gradient of different tones, and that's going to be our kind of sun that's really gone behind the distant areas of land. We've still got that warm glow, but the sun has gone down at sunset. Going to go to our layers, and we're going to create a new layer, layer 4. I'm going to go to our colors. We're going to use the fourth color on the top row still. We're going to go perhaps to the medium brush within airbrushing, and we're going to put the size maybe 10% and 100% opacity. And we're going to run a line across the horizon. I don't want it to be completely straight, so we can allow it to just have a few bumps. Run it across, and the good thing is it's on a separate layer, so now I want it to be slightly pitched like this, but we can go to the transform here, put it on freeform, and we can stretch it out, we can move it up and down, we can get it exactly where we want it to be, stretch it out a little bit beyond the edges, and I definitely want to make sure we get the real strongest pink in here. If it goes too high up, we lose some of the strongest pink, it becomes more washed out. So I'm going to move it down just so we have a healthy amount of that really vibrant pink still remaining there. So I think about here looks good. Deselect, and then underneath there we can just fill that in a little bit. It doesn't really matter. If you want to, just fill it in. You're not going to see most of this. It is going to have other features obscuring it, but it does no harm to fill it in. Now along here, I want some distant trees on that kind of top horizon line. It's not quite horizon, it's not horizontal, but still that is the distant kind of land that we see. So we're going to go to the Evolve brush. I'm going to tap on it and I'm going to put on stroke path spacing. I'm going to turn it up from 24 to maybe about 50%. Click done. And that just introduces a bit more spacing between the little points of texture. So we're going to stick with the fourth color on the top row, maybe 3% size, 80% strength, opacity. And then we can imagine a series of peaks of trees where you press lightly at the top, and then as it comes further down, you can press a bit more, and you don't really need to spend a long time on these. Just press lightly at the top, and then left and right, introduce more of a kind of rocking kind of wiggle to that. And introducing just kind of points really in the distance is not going to be too far wrong. Go over it. You see some of that texture. It was worthwhile having it at the 80% opacity because it introduces some variation. Perhaps we will turn it down just a little bit, maybe to the lowest part of 3%. Does make a little bit difference, but it is also pressure sensitive, so be aware of that. Just do a few spikes upwards. Go back in. And it's a little bit random, this brush, which is why I've chosen it, because it stops you being too uniform in the way that you actually approach each individual tree. It kind of forces you to be a little bit different as you apply it in different areas and different trees, and it will just create some of that variation. It forces that upon us really, which is sometimes very useful. So we'll just run this all the way across. You zoom out, you see that has a different kind of quality when you zoomed out. So just scribbling this up and down really, just create some points. If you need to go back in and scribble over a little bit more, then that's fine. What we're basically aiming for is something like this, a series of shapes like that. So you do the tree trunk, perhaps there's a spike, and then press lightly and then press more and more as you come further down, and you get something approximating a kind of pine tree or a fir tree of some sort, but they don't have to be as neat as all that either. And then any little spaces in between, you just have a few spikes that stick up maybe. These don't have to look overly good in the distance, they're just creating texture. We're going to blur this in slightly as well, and that will take away the sharpness of this texture and make it a little less absolute. I'm going to go to the adjustments, the Gaussian blur, slide it a little bit across, not too much, maybe 2%. That softens it a little bit, but I can also go to my brushes, go to organic rainforest brush, tap on it, put the spacing within stroke path to maybe 45%. Same color, reduce it down, maybe 1%, maybe even less on the opacity, so maybe 70% opacity. And then we can also go in and we can just introduce a bit more texture in there, a bit more softer, a bit more kind of smaller particles to that texture. Just introduce that. I think that the Evolve brush adds some of the real blocky texture which is actually necessary, and then this brush is just a little bit lighter and just softens it, adds a little bit more refinement to that same texture. So a combination of the two I think can work quite nicely. I found with my tutorials as I go along, I'm tending more towards combinations of brushes. I like to use the standard brushes that come with Procreate, but to find ways to combine them. Take one texture, one element, and then blend it with another one. And that can work quite nicely too. Might turn the opacity up actually to 90%. As we come lower down, there's some gaps here. We can just fill some of those in a little bit. Go between here. Anywhere where it looks a little bit too blocky, just go in there and just kind of soften it in a little bit. You can press lightly again, or you can press harder, and you get two completely different looks. So I am pressing more on the lighter side generally to go in between some of these blockier shapes. We have blurred it, but sometimes just a little bit more softness is useful with a different texture. And we're probably going to obscure much of this on the actual edges anyway, but we'll do it. And that's now a slightly better look all the way across, but still we can go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and just another percentage or so, 2% again, and it just blends it all together and softens it. And I think that is working much better. Go to our layers, we'll create a new layer, layer 5, go to our colors, and maybe skip a color. We'll go to the 6th colour. We'll go in perhaps with the airbrushing soft brush, put it down fairly small, 2%, maybe 90% strength, and then just got to imagine where the bottom bit of the trees are. And we're going to run snow, perhaps that's undulating, so it doesn't have to be following that line exactly, but generally it's going to kind of move with that a little bit through here. Again, it doesn't need to be exact, and it can kind of have some breaks in that area as well. Once you've done that line, turn it up 5% maybe, and just underneath that you can run a bit more of this colour. Bring it further down, doesn't need to go all the way. Press more and more lightly, it fades out. And that colour combination you can see is working quite nicely. I'm going to move a longer colour again, so I'm going to go to the 7th colour, stay with the same brush, but I'm going to turn the strength of it down to maybe 40%, and just a little bit further down from that I'm just going to start lightly bringing that in, push it upwards, but not all the way to the very top edge of this snow that we've just created. Perhaps next to the trees we get a little bit of a shadow area. It makes sense. A lot of the blue on the snow is coming from more ambient light, and you can see that the warm colour is over there, so this bit of snow is more in the shadow, so it's not going to pick up too much on those warmer colours really. I'm going to stick to the blues for the distance. It also makes a really nice contrast. We'll go back to layer 4, tap on it and put on the alpha lock, go back to our colours. We will go to the 5th colour. We did skip it a moment ago, but now we're using it. Go to our brushes. We're going to use that organic rainforest brush, the same settings we were using it. 1% size, 90% strength, and you can zoom in just a little bit. And then we can just start going into some of these back areas, just tapping in some of this texture. And it's just enough to suggest snow without being kind of overly obsessed with getting into the detail. We don't need to pick out individual trees for this area. It's going to be quite subtle. You zoom out, you can see the impact. We don't need much of it over at this edge. We're going to do some more prominent trees that cover it, so just in a very general sense, just cover it over a little bit, just so it looks more pleasing as we're working through the tutorial more than anything. But that actually is going to be obscured. Same over at this absolute edge, the very edge, but as we start to come this way, a little bit inwards from that edge, we can just start to use this texture. Maybe just blend it from that line a little bit, and then upwards, just in a kind of zigzag movement really, and then in the in-betweens there a little bit in between those zigzag shapes, but no particular care, very roughly kind of treated. But you start to get a sense of some trees, different layers of texture, and if it becomes too apparent, if it's just a little bit too vivid, then just go in there and just random bits of texture just to soften that in a little bit as well. But you can see when you zoom out now they have a bit more life to them, which is great. We'll go ahead to the top and create a new layer above that, layer 6. Go back to the 4th colour, back in with the drawing evolve brush. Same settings, so that will be low on the 3% size and 80% strength. We can zoom in. And we're just doing some trees in this area now. I'll zoom a bit more. So we've just got an area of trees, so it's not just on that distant area, it's actually pulled forward a little bit. So we have kind of rows of trees breaking up the snow. Again, the individual shapes of trees are not overly important, but I guess they're a bit more distinct because we have this white, or relatively white, it's still very much blue, but it's lighter, so therefore these shapes are going to be a little bit more noticeable. But I really don't intend to spend too long on them either. So just sort of scribble in rough cone shapes, varying sizes, different kind of widths. They can overlap and mush together, that's absolutely fine. And we're going to run this sort of across this area. We'll use the combination of 2 brushes again, so we'll use this initially just to get the general blocked in shape. Make sure some of them are taller, some of them are shorter, maybe right next to it even. Leave varying size gaps between them. Allow them to be kind of different from each other. The worst thing you can really do, the mistake you can make, is to make them all look too similar. So just try to guard against that. Try to make them a bit more random. Some of them are going to be slightly less pointy, perhaps. And then we're approaching the edge of the canvas. Again, it's going to be obscured, so you don't need to worry too much about the very edge, but just for it looking nice in the short term, we'll just do something there anyway. Then I'm going to switch brushes. I'm going to go to the organic rainforest brush, same settings, 1% size, 90% strength, And then I'm just going to introduce this. It's a slightly softer texture. It will blend it in a bit more nicely to the ground, especially if you press on lightly. You can even tap it in a little bit, soften that bottom edge. Again, we have the Gaussian blur at our disposal, so we might use that again a little bit, but just initially use this brush to try to blend it. And then on these actual tree areas too, we can just go in and soften. I don't want any of this texture to be too jarring. I don't want it to be absolutely crystal clear. I want it to be kind of softened in. So we use the combination of the brushes to achieve that look. If there's any little gaps that still remain from the other brush, we can just go over and blot them in a little bit more. On that layer, we'll go to the adjustments, the Gaussian blur, and we'll just blur it in again. 2%, maybe high on the 2%, almost just before it becomes 3, and deselect, and you can see that softened it in again. And again, we can go to that layer, tap on it, put on the alpha lock. A little checkerboard appears, so we know it has put the alpha lock on. Now we can take any color now and it won't go beyond the boundaries. We don't want to use the pink, however. We are going to use the 5th color again, just to create some variation. Let's put it to 100% opacity with the rainforest brush. And again, we're just creating that variation. We don't need to do very much of that, just to stop it looking too flat, if it is doing. And you can see I'm really being quite random with this. Doesn't need a great deal at all. I might switch brushes actually to the airbrushing soft brush. I'm going to go to that layer, turn off the alpha lock again, and I'm going to go in with the 4th color. 2% size, maybe quite low, maybe only 15% strength. And then just underneath the tree area, maybe just blend that in a little bit more. There is perhaps more shadow impacting. These trees are perhaps just casting a bit more gloom on the snow. Just a hint more. Don't need to overdo that. I think that works better. We ground it a bit more. I think I'd quite like to make some adjustment actually here and just reduce the scale of this to give us a little bit more of a distance on here. What we're going to do with these layers now is we're going to take the top layer, tap on it and merge down. We're going to take that version, merge down. And I'm actually going to reduce the scale of this. Go to the transform, uniform, and just reduce it down. And I've decided actually I want that feature to be kind of smaller in the distance. Gives us a bit more space either side. Sometimes these changes occur to you halfway through a piece of work, and that's absolutely fine. I'm showing you methods that actually we can continue to amend, manipulate and adjust an image. Tap on the layer, slide and duplicate that layer, the bottom version of it, of layer 4. Go back to the transform, freeform, and then we can spread this out. And we can kind of elongate what we've already got. Deselect. And there's a couple of jarring points, but I'm not overly worried about that either, because we can go to the top version, tap on it and merge down. Go to the smudge tool, put it on something like the soft brush with an airbrushing, 2% size, maybe, well, 90% strength. And then all we need to do is just blend it in at those points and just soften in any jarring lines that may become a distraction later on, although we're going to have features over here anyway. That's quickly disappeared. Maybe we'll also turn off the alpha lock. And we can really blend this in quite successfully. And by the end of just subtly going over that line wherever it appears, we won't even notice that that adjustment has really been made. Now the benefit of that is now that we've got even more refined detail and more space on our canvas, and I think that looks better for it. I'm not bothered about the bottom line. We will go to that and we will amend that anyway, but if you just want to soften it in so it looks less jarring, the bigger size smudge, that's fine. I'm going to go to our layers, create a new layer, layer 5. I'm going to go in with the drawing, evolve brush. Same settings as before. We're going to go in with the 4th color again on the top row. I'm going to put the brush size low in that 3% and still 80% strength. We'll just zoom in a little bit. And we're going to have much of this obscured over at this side, so you don't need to be overly neat about that. I guess the point where it's become more apparent is somewhere around here. So we're going to use much of the same technique. Points, scribbles as it comes further down, kind of zigzag, left to right. We're aiming at kind of rough cones, or rough cone shapes, but we don't need to overly agonize on them. Allow yourself to work quite loosely, quite roughly. as you move across. I'll just speed through these just for the sake of efficiency on the tutorial. There's no point you watching the same technique over and over and over again. So we'll just fast forward through this small section. When it gets to the edges, I'm just going to scribble in. I don't really care about those. We're not going to notice them. They're going to be obscured by more prominent, closer to trees anyway. Again, we're going to go to the organic rainforest brush. And once more, with the same settings, actually we put it up to 100, didn't we? Slightly backwards from that, maybe 90%. And we'll just go in there and slightly soften the look of these. And I'm really not spending any time, just straight up and down scribbling, moving it along. It's enough to just slightly obscure and soften those absolute kind of blocky shapes. You get that kind of upwards and downwards suggestion of spikes of the tops of trees anyway, just by doing that scribble in this way. Okay, we're going to go again to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, zoom in, blur it in, maybe 2%, deselect. And again, with that layer, put on the alpha lock. And again, we're going to go in with the fifth color with the rainforest brush, maybe 80% opacity and low on the 2% size. And we just want to create some subtle variation in that color, a bit more texture, stop it being quite so flat. We don't need to really worry about the edges here. I really don't care about being overly detailed on this. Not much of this is actually going to show through. These are going to be more prominent actually in the distance. This area, it matters a little bit less. So we're going to move forward. We're going to go to our layers, create a new layer, layer 6. We're going to go in with the airbrushing medium brush. I'm going to go for the fourth color on the middle row, 5% size, 100% opacity. Now I'm going to take it from over here over to the side, hold it till it snaps, and then you can adjust it. I want it to be slightly pitched, angled. We can go to the transform, whoops, transform again, and you can move it down so you see a bit more of the trees maybe. Put it on freeform, stretch it out if you need to, so make sure it doesn't leave little awkward gaps. So somewhere about here. Now it is a very straight line. I don't want it to be completely straight, so I could go to the adjustments, liquify, put it on the push, put it up to maybe 50% size, 50% pressure, and then I can maybe just push it up slightly, just create a little bit of a swell, maybe put it up even more actually, 70% or so, just a little bit more of a swell here. I don't want it to be too kind of undulating, but just subtly so it's not completely straight. Then we can go back in with the medium brush rather, maybe bigger on the size, 20% or so, and just fill in that bottom area. That's absolutely fine. Tap on that layer now, put on the alpha lock, go back to our colors. First of all, we'll go to the very end, the 10th color, same settings, we'll just do a band of this. Again, just generally following that kind of line. Back color, the 9th color, do a band of that. 8th color, maybe turn it down a touch, 15%. Just aim for the middle of that line. 7th color, maybe down again, 10%. Aim to get on that line like so. 6th color, along here. 5th color, along here, like that. And you just leave a thin amount of that kind of original cool blue at the top. And then we can go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and blur all of that in. We really don't want to see much in terms of the texture. Now, it doesn't need to be absolute. So it doesn't need to be so blended in that it's completely flat looking, but you don't want to see the lines, obviously. Having said that, a little suggestion of kind of almost ripples in the snow is quite useful. So we need to pick our point. So maybe somewhere about the 25% actually works for us. I'm going to go back a layer to layer 5 and create a new layer, layer 7, but it's underneath layer 6. I'm going to go to my brushes. I'm going to use the evolve brush within drawing. Again, we're going to go to the first color on the middle row. We're going to do some more prominent trees now. So we just got predominantly a kind of silhouette, really quite dark. Do a couple of smaller ones down here to begin with. Maybe put the brush size down to the 2%, size 80% strength, and well, it's just going to be darker. We'll do the tree trunk, and we'll do a similar method to what we did with the other ones, but we're just allowing it to be a little bit more obvious in terms of the branch shapes. And because the brush is smaller, it just behaves in a different way. We don't need to worry about that bottom edge because it is underneath. And then maybe we could do another one here. Scribble it in a bit more if we have to. Zoom in. You can always then, after the rough scribbling in, go in and add some more definition on branches. We don't need to do too much. We are going to also use the organic rainforest brush. Same settings as before, except 1% size, 80% strength, and we can add to this. Again, just soften it in. Just softening in the overall impact, the edges, make it a little less harsh where we need to. Go back to the Drawing Evolve brush, and we can just do some smaller kind of brushes, artifacts over here, just suggestions of things. You don't need to do too many of them. And then we are now going to concentrate on the bigger trees. So same settings, but these trees can really extend quite high up into the image. Now we've got it on the low part of 2%, maybe just a little bit higher. We can just rock from left to right. I'm pitching the branches a little bit more upwards, certainly at the top, and tapping it in whilst also trying to get a kind of branch shape. So I am obviously thinking that's the tree trunk, and I'm generally going for this kind of an effect. But I don't want it to look obviously like this. I'm trying to make it a bit more random with texture, with needles, with snow, anything else. So it's useful to bear that general shape in mind, but not actually draw it as such. Using that as a kind of blueprint in your mind, and then you don't really stick to it in actual fact. I really have tried to make these kind of trees as simple as possible. They obviously need to look decent. We don't want them to look terrible, but also at the same time, you don't need to spend an age perfecting each individual tree. Somewhere in the middle, where we're spending a decent amount of time to make them look acceptable, but we're not spending too long on them. Maybe do a smaller one here. So they only take a minute or so each tree. And honestly, sometimes quite a bit less than a minute sometimes. Like for example, this one is next to it, is going to collide with it. It's going to mush together. Don't need to spend quite as long. It's a slightly smaller tree anyway. And that was only a few seconds in reality. When they go together, just scribble over them both. That's another tree. Just check the angle of it. Want to try and keep them vertical. Maybe another one here that does go above this point into the pink kind of sky. Not all of them need to, but I think it's effective when they do. Leave some gaps in the tree here and there. Nice to vary them up. And again, although we've got one here, I'm not going to respect it too much. I'm going to allow this tree to just sort of collide into it. I'm not going to overly worry about that. And then when you start to get a collection of them all together, they will just blot out a whole area. It becomes kind of easier. I'm going to add a little bit of snow texture on top as well, so it's all good. Maybe just a little bit more at the top. And then maybe one more really prominent tree that's probably the tallest of the lot. Give it a bit more of its own space. Use that outer edge of the canvas as a guide to make sure it is vertical. Give it a nice point at the top. Again, just kick out the branches. Make sure they are slightly swinging upwards. Use that kind of rocking motion left to right. It is useful. Just swinging one way to the other. Gives you the rough sense of it in there quite effectively, I think. You can always go back over it. Once it gets beyond a certain point down here, then you really don't actually notice the individual branches so much. You could turn it up 4%, blot them in. Down here, doesn't matter so much. And then there could be another one here that you don't really see, but it's just off the edge. And that works quite well. Even without any snow texture on it, I think that would probably be okay. But we are going to add snow to it in a minute, but we're going to do the rest. 3% size, maybe just a few more. Again, have them taller, extending up into the pink area. I mean, they're not going to be as detailed as these ones, so you can just get a few in there in super efficient way. As I've just shown you there. You can always go back over it and refine it if you feel you need to, which I probably will, at least a little bit, but it doesn't require a great deal of work necessarily. Zoom in a touch. Let's turn that down again, 2% size. Again, just swing left to right. You will get more efficient at this. The more you do, you begin to get a bit more confident and speed up a little bit. Just refine these ones a touch more, but honestly, it doesn't need a great deal. Fill in some of those gaps maybe. That's perfectly adequate. Texture, perfectly fine. Another one here, and maybe just another one here. Just rock left to right. in a very simple way, and then just scribble. Okay, now some of your values might be a little bit less. You could always go to the layer, slide and duplicate it if that's the case, and it will just blot in some of the paler areas if they're a bit too soft. I'm going to go to that layer. In fact, the top version, tap on it and merge down now. And on that version, I'm going to go to the adjustments, the Gaussian blur, and just soften it in slightly. Maybe 2%, deselect, tap on that layer, put on the, try again, put it on the alpha lock. I'm going to go to the second color on the middle row, go in with the organic rainforest brush. Again, same settings as before, 1% size, 80% strength. And, well, we definitely want to start breaking up some of that absolute black color. So we can just start to do bands of texture here. We've got a very prominent tree, so we need to make sure that we kind of respect that tree and give it a little bit of texture before we deal with the other ones. It is going to jump forward. You just add in kind of dashes and texture. We don't need to worry, you can't add anything in the background, it only will apply it inside the tree, or inside these black areas anyway. I'm just generally imagining the snow on this tree to begin with, ignoring the others for now. And that just brings it a bit further forward. We can even go to the third colour on the middle row. Just add a few highlights of snow. I don't intend to do too much of that. I want this to be relatively minimal. I've done plenty of other kind of snow trees where we really go into a lot more detail, but these are a bit more subtle. Second colour again. Maybe the second colour will be sufficient to actually deal with the rest of the trees. I don't want the detail on them to be too prominent, so just a little bit of suggestion here and there. That's probably enough. A little bit can go a long way. Just add some into these ones. Maybe leave some gaps in the snow texture too. Pick a more prominent one, so I think one about here. So map out that shape first. Have some bands. Imagine the individual branches, bits of snow. You can see I'm just really applying it quite randomly. Now once that one's in, just a bit more for one or two. I hope you can appreciate this is extremely quick, and if it takes you a little bit longer, that's fine, but you can see it doesn't need to be overly neat. So that's enough kind of texture for those trees. I think they look perfectly fine in context with the whole image. So now we've got the foreground snow and maybe some footprints, and that really is what's going to draw the eye and really make the image. So first of all, I'm going to go to layer 6. The alpha lock is still on. I'm going to go in with the fourth colour on the middle row, airbrushing, soft brush, 2% size, 40% strength, and just on that top edge, make sure that we've got a little bit of that blue. Just soften that edge so it doesn't go instantly to a warm colour or a bright colour. And then maybe we could even try a darker blue. So third colour on the middle row, but we need to turn that down. 20% strength, and then just subtly go over that edge. Don't want to overdo that, but just subtly kind of subdue that edge so we do get some of that nice blue to begin with. I do think it's an important colour. That just improves the look of that top edge, I think. Perhaps we'll go to the sixth colour on the middle row, going with a soft brush, go to 5% size and maybe 50% strength, and we'll just bring in some bands of this colour. I just want to slightly vary it up a little bit. I do want some slight variation, so it's not too smooth. Press lightly as you come further down. Turn the size of the brush up, maybe 10%. Bring a band of this lighter colour down here, but only subtly. We're just, again, pushing that sense of kind of undulations in the snow. Maybe go and create a new layer, layer 8, and then we'll go to maybe the 10th colour on the middle row initially. Soft brush with an airbrushing, 1% size and maybe 20% strength. And then we can just imagine some footprints that have just trailed off into the distance up here. You won't notice them too much until they get kind of closer to us. They get bigger, more in focus. And then you can just start to have some kind of dashes initially that kind of merge together. Zoom in a bit more. And they don't need to be obvious kind of footprints. They're just areas perhaps with in really deep snow especially, you're not going to have a neat footprint shape. But it is definitely an area where the snow has been collapsed. So you get a big kind of nice wide shape. And then another one. Keep it kind of random looking. So you can imagine a foot and a leg, maybe even up to the knee has gone in. Some of these, maybe not that deep, but certainly deeper than just the foot. So again, we don't need to make this a foot shape at all. Just keep zooming out, thinking about how it leads to us. So I can probably get another 3 or 4 in here. And obviously if it's left, right, you're going to have a sense of that direction. So that was maybe the right leg and foot. So we have to accommodate one for the left. Maybe turn it up a little bit as we get closer to us. 2%. Doesn't matter if we start off a little bit too light initially. Just get in the placement. Nice big area here. Blotting one over here. Let's turn the strength up. 50%. Whoops. Maybe 3% size. Just help get it in there. We'll work on the refinement of these in a moment. Another one here. And then one really prominent one. One last one. Goes right down to the edge. I probably need a darker blue for this one. So maybe the first colour on the bottom row. We'll set that blue aside for specifically this. Okay. And it doesn't need to be particularly convincing at this point. That's not a problem. It's just rough kind of blob shapes really. Add some of this darker blue just in maybe the first 3. Okay, so we've got a sense, we've got the path that leads through, but we need to refine them a little bit more. So just go back to the 10th colour and just, if you need to, just firm them in a little bit more. In fact, what we could do is slide and duplicate that layer. That is just going to make them a bit bolder, as you can see. Tap on the top version, merge down, so now it's on one layer. That's perfect. We're going to go to the smudge, put the smudge on the soft brush with an airbrushing, low on the 2% size, maybe 90% strength, and well, from some of these bits that stick out, we're just going to drag it down. And that's going to create the sense of an edge, and the light is just catching it, it's dragging it down, and the light is just catching it. And it's going to create this slight impression of depth to this. So I'm just doing it on the left hand side for the moment. So any obvious place like this. So let's go and look at the really near to one. So any obvious sort of bit that juts in from the left, just drag it down. Can we find another little, there's almost like a little bump here that just cuts in. So we'll bring it down from there as well. And maybe from this side, there's an obvious bit that juts in here. We can just drag it in. And if there isn't an obvious one, well, you can create one. Just to exaggerate the point. And that's starting to get the sense that it's collapsing in on itself, but you're just bringing in the light effect. So it's falling in on itself almost. So it gives it a depth, but it also kind of represents the light catching it as well. You can push some of these to sharper corners, angles, and that's fine too. That can work quite nicely. Push them out to show up sharper little points. Flatten it out. And you can see that starting to look like a deep shape in the snow. In quite an effective and pleasing way. And then as we get back here, obviously it's going to require less detail, but let's just push them out a little bit. Get that kind of sideways movement, because that's what's going to happen with things that go off in the distance. It's going to just stretch it out left to right a little bit, so you'll see that shape more prominently, and less of the up and down. Okay, let's go to the more foreground ones again. Just drag down from that area here. So whenever you get a kind of corner, maybe less on the back side of it, because you're not going to get as much of the light hitting. But certainly on these bits, you're going to get a dragging down of that colour. Dragging down from there slightly. Pull down from the walls of the snow to bring some of that colour in. Okay, we're going to work on the top edge. We're going to have bits of snow that kind of create lumps. So we're going to go back to our brush, soft brush, go maybe for the second colour. In fact, we'll go for the third colour initially. Have it smaller, 1% size, quite subtle at 20% strength. And there's just going to be bits. In fact, we need to have that even smaller, low on the 1%. It's quite potent. So we just have lumps of snow that just stick up. Catch the light a little bit along the edge. Not so much on that line, but not nothing either. But it's definitely going to be more apparent whenever we've got a kind of an edge that's got a few lumps on it. Maybe you're just going to have the top edge of it catching the light. But equally, we can also use the first colour. So if it's a lump that catches the light, well, it's also going to cast a shadow. To use the two in combination, if it's big enough to stick up and catch the light, then it's definitely going to cast a shadow. So third colour again, just along that edge a little bit. And then probably the bit that's going to catch the light the most is this edge down here. So you can really define this a little bit more. Give that a little bit more of this. And you can start to see the effect of it now, I think, a little bit more. Maybe turn that up a little bit. Higher on the 1%. Bit more of this over here. Maybe turn it down about 15% or so. And just create the sense of kind of lumps in the snow. But we can also smooth it in too. I mean, we want these sections to be textured, but then the surrounding snow to be kind of pristine and kind of unbroken, really. Now we've got these bits that we dragged down, so let's just follow those, maybe add a bit more highlight to them, exaggerate them a little bit more. But we can go in the kind of inner part of that and maybe use a lighter blue. So we'll go back to the 10th colour. We've got the darker colour as a base, but we can use this lighter blue. And then maybe at the bottom part of this, we can have just the sense that there's flattened out texture as well. Maybe we need to turn it up a little bit to 30% or so. We can be flattened out snow down here. So you get kind of more horizontal lines, and then it joins the edges and then goes up, banks up. And it's subtle, but I think it's important. And I think you do notice it when it actually zooms out. It just gives it that kind of authenticity. It works better. And same with this colour. Although it appears lighter down there, it will appear darker up here. So you can just soften this in where you need to. Okay, and just create some blobs around the edges. So as well as the highlights, you've got some lumps that create a little bit of a shadow on the other side of it as well. So you won't get a highlight without also having a shadow in a sense. And if you create something that has a little bit of a shadow, like a spherical shape, then it also is going to have a top edge that catches the light. So the two will work together. Perhaps go back to the first colour on the bottom row. We need that darker colour down here to show up, otherwise it's not really going to be visible because it's quite a dark blue down here relatively. And now you can see the detail on that is much more than the others. Perhaps go to the second colour, and this is again just that extra bit brighter, so low on that 1%, 30% strength. And now we can just, in some really prominent bits, if we think it's really sticking up and it really would catch the light, just use that to exaggerate it even more. And again, on that bottom edge, just add the highlight. It's really going to catch the most light on this particular line down here. And you know, it's quite time consuming just to get this right, but I think it sells the whole image. When the foreground details look good, then it lends some of that detail to the whole image. So back to the first colour on the bottom row, maybe just a couple of stray lumps that surround it, soften them in. Third colour, soft highlights too. And then I'm going to concentrate on these other ones. So with this third colour still, low on the 1% size, maybe 40% strength. I'm going to go in on this bottom part and just really add the highlights in first. If I just do those to begin with, I think that is going to make the biggest impact. Obviously, as we get further away, that is going to be less noticeable. So you don't need to worry about that. It's just these first three, probably, that you're going to notice that light colour. And then just a bit of kind of debris, turbulent kind of bits that have churned up a little bit on the edges. Maybe I need to go to the second colour for it to be noticeable up here. Back to the, well, actually probably the 10th colour on the middle row. It's sufficient for up here where it is getting a bit lighter anyway. And again, you can see the impact on that. I think it really just, this one is lending the realism, the detail to the other ones without having to do as much on those either, which is really useful. Just a few extra little bits surrounding them as we come up here. Don't need to be quite as detailed anyway. Again, go in with the smudge, soft brush, 1% size, 90% strength, just like we did in the foreground. Just slope down some of the banks, some of the sides of this, just to create that sense of depth with these. as they go further back as well. Don't need to do it as much. Maybe the 9th colour. Brush, just some snow settled at the bottom. 10th colour. More of a horizontal texture for that. A bit more with the highlights and the 2nd colour. I think I just want to exaggerate it slightly in places. I think that actually sells the illusion to the rest of the image quite successfully, and I'm quite happy with that. A couple more on here. Perhaps with the 10th colour, we could have a couple of smaller points in the snow, and then we could also go in with the 2nd colour on the bottom row, create that highlight. There's no reason why we can't have a couple of smaller little holes, little breaks there. We could make more of these. Maybe the 10th colour, create a couple more here, 2nd colour, bottom edge just to create the highlights. Gives it that little hole, a little depth. Doesn't really work without it. So you've got two different effects. You've got a lump that sticks up, where it's light on the top, dark on the bottom, or if it goes into the snow, it's dark on the top of that shape and then light at the bottom. And you can see how dramatic the difference is there, really. Very noticeable, the difference. And then, last of all, we perhaps can create a new layer, layer 9. We can go in with the artistic leatherwood brush. Now if I tap on it, I've changed the spacing within stroke path to, let's put it to 60%. And I'm going to use maybe the 9th colour on the bottom row. And I'm just going in here in the darkest sections, and it's going to be quite subtle. I'm just creating a little bit of a texture in this bit, and it doesn't need to be particularly neat. I'm trying to keep it that kind of rough horizontal. I know I've got the canvas angled, but I'm kind of respecting that horizontal. Whoops, I should delete all that with a gesture. So I'm doing it in the darkest section, where perhaps you would notice this texture a little bit more. Just scribble it across this whole region. You can zoom in, then you can really see it. It's going to be a subtle effect, but it almost adds a little bit of grain to the snow. We've used that, so maybe we could do an even lighter colour. Let's go for the 8th colour at the top, and perhaps we need to turn it down a little bit more from the 60 for this, so 40% or so. You can press lightly too. Try to avoid getting too much in the way of obvious lines. I think that's the trick with this, is to press lightly enough that you can kind of suggest it, scribble it in without getting obvious bands of it. So try to just subtly start to bring it in. Don't need too much of it, and that's probably enough. Then I'll go to the adjustments, the Gaussian blur, and just blur it in, maybe 2%, deselect. And you can see it's just added a little bit of texture there in the foreground. It's not much, but it just hints at the kind of texture that you might see in snow, just so it's not completely flat looking. And it's quite a simple image. The detail is definitely in the footprints, in the snow. I hope you've enjoyed following along. Don't forget to hit subscribe. It really helps out the channel. No.